Inflation, corporate greed, extortion. So this is what's been going on in the headlines over the recent since last year in the wake of the prices rising up. So I'm gonna tell you what I've been hearing and from my observation of what I can understand is that we've heard the stories how during the last years when Trump, you know, destroyed the economy through trade war, uh, tariffs, and of course, the pandemic hit. It's what's been the cause of the economic decline of this year. And it seems like how we are witnessing of what's been talked about in the headlines how the government incompetence of the Trump administration has been continuing on through this Biden administration, and how the legacy of the Trump administration through its pandemic incompetence and his economic tariffs have caused the instability of what's been going through right now in the Biden administration. And we're also hearing talks about how his government incompetence and trying to get back things together is also stirring up things with the local economy. Well, that's what we've been hearing in the headlines. And we are hearing all these things how, like, the progressives are now calling out this corporate greed that it's been the cause of the high rising inflation of the economy and plus the leftovers of the pandemic. Well, speaking of the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic, here's what I've noticed is that yes, the pandemics are a very mega profitable business, just like war. They know how to trick their customers or citizens into thinking that how the lack of supplies and the lack of government will is causing their misfortune. Well, at least that's what we've been hearing. And also, like, these top notch billionaires had really made a lot of money during the pandemic while their citizens are suffering. Well, especially here in the United States, how these rich people they were making a lot of money, and while the citizens had no choice when they had to pay their dues, rents, or make ends meet, that they have to work, but they didn't want to go out because they didn't want to be infected by the virus. And so that's why, there have been COVID deaths in the workplace during in 2020 and early years of 2021. So, about inflation, and of course, the companies are going to make a lot of price gouging in order to, make some recoveries and to really gain profits. So, it seems like what we are witnessing is that before I really get into this bottom line is so I'm in the business and I know how things work. I know how supply and demand is really the thing. And I'm not really much of an economics background, but I could tell you based from, me being the business is if there's any specific supplies that are we are very short of, well, that's all we do like other business is to raise up the price in order to make some recoveries. Especially if the business is not doing well, we have to raise up the price in order to gain some losses. And I know of some people in business who are like this too, and that's how business works. But it seems like what we are witnessing right now is not an issue of the painful leftovers during the COVID pandemic and plus the government incompetence from the previous administration. It seems like what we are witnessing is, according to somewhat progressive politicians are saying, is a form of corporate greed, while it is true. And what we are witnessing also is a form of extortion from its customers and citizens, while it is true. Before I get there, I need to say that how when I used to hear these stories a lot, how like the pandemic really hit and some companies are trying to recover. Some of the companies were shut down, and plus they had to raise the price, and plus the government incompetence, the trade wars, the tariffs, and the list goes on. And that's the stuff that I used to hear all the time. And plus you got this war in Ukraine going, and it's also been hitting up in a lot of countries who rely on Russia and Ukraine for, food supplies, especially countries around Asia and Africa. But, when the oil gas price were rising up, I was always hearing the story of how, there was a hack, there was a government sanction to raise the price, or it's their version of a speedy recovery from the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic. But, well, after this friend of mine was telling me how these companies have a trick in terms of how to really regain some profits. And this is something that you won't be hearing in the mainstream, especially that I haven't heard anything about this from any, politician. Well, some progressive politicians have only been talking in the congressional floor how these companies racked billions of the high gas prices, and the customers and the consumers had to pay a high price for it. So, after this friend of mine told me how these companies have a trick in saying that there's shortages or they can't, hire drivers to provide the supply. So let's start off with the oil companies. So they purposely say that there's shortage of oil and that they're not hiring any drivers to deliver the oil to gas stations. And so they they stage an incident that will give them the excuse to jack up the price and saying that there's no other choice. And so and then they know that they have lots of oil barrels on stock, but they just don't want to tell you. And they purposely don't hire any drivers to give the excuse or give the impression that there's shortage of oil and there's no drivers. There's shortage of drivers, and that there are no drivers to be hired to for them to deliver the oil to local gas stations. And so they go around and say that, oh, we have to jack up the price because we don't have any drivers who are willing to deliver the gas, the oil to the gas stations, and that we're a shortage of oil. So how can I hire any drivers? So there you go. Now let's start with the distribution companies, like the companies that deliver to department stores like Walmart or Target. So what we have seen, there was a headline about how there was a shortage of baby formula. How there was also saying how corporate greed also played a role. And now we've heard the stories of how the economic trade war and the tariffs also caused the amount of shortages of baby formulas. But it seems like there's something that we're not seeing in the headline, that what is actually going on behind the scenes. I'm not touting any conspiracy, but I'm only saying that, you know, it seems like what we're witnessing isn't true. That so these companies have a lot of stock of different items, but they just don't want to tell you that they have lots of stock. They just want to tell you how they have their shortage, that they are very short of supplies, and that's why there's no drivers to hire and deliver to their local Target or Walmart or BK or Ross or you know local grocery store. And they stage this, and they're always touting how, oh, we have to jack up the price because we are short of supply and we have no drivers to hire. You see, not all companies are like this, but I'm only talking about those specific companies who really have a lot of items on stock and go around in front of the camera and say how they're shortage or they're very short of supplies, but behind the scenes they actually have a lot of stock. And we are witnessing how they're saying that, like, oh, there's a blockade from shipment deliveries to China, well, or from China, and that's why we have no supplies being shipped in, or imports. Well, it is true, but I'm talking about like those who have lots of imports from countries like China or parts of Asia, that there's a blockade, and that's why they are not able to make all these deliveries. While it is true that, like, in some companies, how when the COVID pandemic hit, that during a shipment blockade, that there were shortages. Well, yes, it is true. But what I'm saying is that, like, how when these companies have a very big amount of supply, and then they're making excuse saying that they have a shortage in order to cheat its customers, to jack up the price. That's not an issue of inflation anymore. That is an extortion. And not only is an extortion, it's sabotage. So yes, you see, if you have a company that heavily relies on imports, and there's a blockade, of course, it gives a very bad effect. Or if it's locally made, then there's not enough to manufacture or farm or harvest. That's understandable. But if you're a company that locally makes things, locally manufactures and harvest or farm, and then you stage a shortage supply by saying on camera how we have shortage of supply, that's why we have to jack up the price, and that the citizens of the United States have to believe this. Well, you are sabotaging the economy. It's not anymore about government incompetence, that there was inflation, or that there's a recession of a speedy recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's why after this analysis that I was telling you, I started to turn off the headlines of what people are saying about inflation or recession. That what's really going on isn't really what it is. That's why I unplugged myself from people who are saying that it's this is a recovery from the COVID or government incompetence. While it is true they play a role, but their role is about maybe average. But these are big companies who are cheating their customers by creating an economic sabotage by staging a shortage in order to rake profits. And I'm in the business. I know how things work, but I'm not in that situation right now. But if you're gonna say that, like, oh, you have supply, but you say that you're shortages and you're gonna raise up the price, you're in trouble right there. And there are those who are now saying that it's corporate greed that is the cause of inflation. While yes, it is true. And then of course, some of these pundits or commentators that say that corporate greed is not the cause of inflation are the same very apologists defending inflation or saying that, oh, it's the government incompetence that has been the cause of inflation, and it's the fault of the president. He's putting heavy regulations in the big companies. While you know yeah, I've heard that same thing. I've heard that same thing all over again because if you bump into news articles or blogs or opinion columns that say that corporate greed is not the cause of inflation or corporate greed isn't the cause of inflation, basically it's kind of the same thing that you'll be hearing all over again, that how it's the government incompetence that has been causing all this inflation thing. Well, I've heard the same story so many times. That's why anything that says that corporate greed is not causing inflation, I'm not buying it because that's what I've heard all over. That's what I've heard so many times. So moving on, when Venezuela was all over the news in 2019 during the uprising, the media was always going around and saying how the government and the socialist government was causing an amount of shortages in supermarkets. And it turned out that that wasn't true. The main opposition is one of the largest food distribution companies or distribution companies in Venezuela is a diehard opposition of the Venezuelan government. And so when the shortages of Venezuela was like all over news, it turned out that the opposition who owns the largest food distribution company or distribution company called Empresas Pilar, if I'm not mistaken, if that's named correctly, they were actually staging shortages and start blaming the government, how it's the government's fault that they're not putting any regulations. That's why there was like a lot of shortages in Venezuela, quote unquote. And so that's when I so after this friend of mine told me how these oil companies stage this inflation. That's always the same thing of greedy crony capitalists who are causing or staging all this and saying that it's the government's fault that they're transitioning in to make heavy regulations against companies. So yes, I know how things work in the business, and even though that I don't have that much business experience, but you could imagine how, when you conduct business to these people, you can see how, money can really overpower you. And so, if you want to rig more profits, you want to be greedy, just jack up the price, rip off your customers. And that's how, greedy capitalism works. Not that I'm saying that I'm trying to be not that I'm trying to, I'm just trying to be economically reasonable. That that's how, corporate greed works. And I'm saying that I'm not like that. I'm not saying I'm like that, but I'm just telling you how this kind of platform of corporate greed works. And that you gotta cheat your customers. And now, pandemic is a mega profitable business. And greedy billionaires will keep making a lot of money, spreading fear, and those who die from a pandemic disease. So that was the same story that I've heard all over again. How this it's a recovery from the pandemic, or it's was the previous administration's government incompetence. But it seems like what I told you, how these big companies do their schemes, just like I have described to you from a friend of mine. It turns out that that's what we're witnessing. So yes, what we're witnessing is not a source of recovery from a pandemic or a series of inflation from, incompetence of the lack of political will, but it's an issue of economic sabotage and extortion coming from these companies who say that they're having a lack of supplies and that they have shortages. That's why they are jacking up the price. That they're but behind the scenes, they have a lot on stock. They have lots of supplies on stock, but they are purposely not hiring any drivers to give the impression that there's really shortages. Yeah, everything is staged, just as I said. And the greedy defense contractors in the military industrial complex with this Ukraine war going are making lots and lots of money off of the one of the bloodiest wars this year. So yes. And now we have, I think, this monkeypox. We just had a coronavirus. Now we're having a monkeypox. Now I'm not saying that it's fake or that there's any fear, but I'm just only telling you how people in power will be making a lot of money over this fear mongering of another pandemic, and we that if there's anything you gotta be fear of, it's a pandemic. That oh, we just had a coronavirus, now we have a monkeypox. Oh my gosh, fear mongering. But just to remind you, stay strong and stay healthy, okay? But I'm just only telling you overall how the pandemic is a mega profitable business, and quote unquote inflation or economic sabotage is also another form of a mega profitable business. So that's it for my video. I haven't did any thorough research on this, but this is just my what I've been observing and from what people have been telling me. So just be careful with the things you read or hear. So that's my advice.